We gather this morning
called forth by love,
to find joy and comfort in one another,
to bear each other's burdens and celebrate the mystery of life.
come, let us worship together.
This morning's chalice lighting is written by Ben Sewell, Making Aspirations Real. We light this chalice, the symbol of our faith, knowing that this morning many others across this land and around the world are doing the same. For us and for our far-flung kin, it is a light of peace, of justice, and of love. But without work, these aspirations flicker out as soon as the candle is extinguished. Let us all join together to accept the challenge of doing the hard work that makes these aspirations real. Please rise in body or in spirit and join us in hymn number 347, Gather the Spirit.
Gather the Spirit, harvest the power. Our separate fires will kindle one flame. Witness the mystery of this hour. Our trials in this light appear all the same. Gather in peace, gather in thanks, gather in sympathy now and then. Gather in hope, compassion and strength. Gather to celebrate once again. Gather the spirit of heart and mind. Seeds for the sowing are laid in store, nurtured in love and conscience refined.
with body and spirit united once more. Gather in peace, gather in thanks, gather in sympathy now and then. Gather in hope, compassion, and strength. Gather to celebrate once again. Gather the Spirit growing in all, drawn by the moon and fed by the sun. Winter to spring and summer to fall, the chorus of life resounding as one. Gather in peace, gather in thanks, gather in sympathy now and then. Gather in hope, compassion, and strength. Gather to celebrate once again.
On July 4th, people across the United States celebrate Independence Day. For some of us, this day comes with a set of contradictions, both in the country's founding as well as how we have acted as a nation over time. At the founding, it was stated that all men are created equal, but enslaved and indigenous people were not included in this equality. And of course, men did not have the universal meaning of human beings as it was sometimes used in the 18th century. It actually meant only men. In terms of how we behaved over time, we have celebrated our freedom from being ruled by a foreign power, but we continued to celebrate that freedom as the U.S. directly took over 1/3 of Mexico and never ceded it back. However, the founding of the United States was a significant step forward in political history, despite all its imperfections. It was the first significant establishment of European people that was based on a democratic republic, the right to vote leaders into and out of office, the freedom to practice one's own religion, freedom of speech, and citizenship that is not based on nationality. We will focus on the positive aspects of what America stands for and challenge ourselves to continue to extend the underlying principles that not only brought about American freedom starting in 1776, but also brought about the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, women's suffrage, the move toward greater economic equality during the Great Depression, and the extension of suffrage through the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts of the 1960s. While there are numerous shortcomings in our country's founding, it is the founding ideals that provided the basis for the repair of some of the shortcomings. Today we'll reflect on the ideals upon which the country was based, ideals that even manifest themselves in several of our UU principles. We'll also reflect on what it means to continue not just to celebrate these ideals, but protect them and strengthen them in a time when we are at great risk of losing the very democratic principles upon which this country was founded.
The mission of Birmingham Unitarian Church is to be a free and welcoming religious community that encourages lives of integrity, learning, service, and joy. One way we live out this mission is by giving half our weekly offering to a nonprofit organization that shares our values and addresses needs in one of these areas: environmental action, economic justice, civic engagement, and racial justice. We generally support a new organization each month. However, this month we will continue our support for the Michigan Environmental Justice Coalition, which works to achieve a clean, healthy, and safe environment for those Michigan residents who suffer the greatest impact of climate change and inadequate economic policies. Let there be an offering in support of our beloved community and organizations that build the world we dream about. This morning's offering will now be received with gratitude. Ushers, please come forward. Come forward. We are a church of open minds, loving hearts, and helping hands. With gratitude, we dedicate this offering to the good works of our congregation and dedicate ourselves to its service. Thank you.
Come to the time in our service when we celebrate the joys and sorrows of the congregation. We have one sorrow that was missed in a previous week, which is from Max and Lisa Court. Max's dad, Jack Court, passed away on June 14th. We loved him, and we will greatly miss him. We have a joy from Kimberly Campbell-Fox. An ongoing joy for all of BUC is our wonderful team of worship associates. The hours of work that go into preparing lay-led services make for thoughtful and varied voices and are a cause for deep gratitude from all of us. Thank you, Kimberly. As we celebrate Independence Day, may we renew our commitment to the best of American ideals that were stated prayerfully by Abraham Lincoln. May we be dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead, we take increased devotion to that cause for which they here have given the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and the government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
Comfort me, comfort me, comfort me, oh my soul. Comfort me, comfort me, comfort me, oh my soul. Sing with me, sing with me, sing with me, oh my soul. Sing with me, sing with me, sing with me, oh my soul. Speak for me. Speak for me. Speak for me. Speak for me, oh my soul. Speak for me. Speak for me. Speak for me, oh my soul.
From the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their powers from the consent of the governed. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. He has refused to pass other laws for the accommodation of large districts of people, unless those people would relinquish the right of representation. He has called together legislative bodies at places unusual, uncomfortable, and distant from the repository of their public records for the sole purpose of fatiguing them into compliance with his measures. For taking away our charters, abolishing our most valuable laws, and altering fundamentally the forms of our governments. For suspending our own legislatures and declaring themselves invested with power to legislate for us in all cases whatsoever. A prince whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant is unfit to be the ruler of a free people.
On July 4th, 1976, I celebrated the 4th of July in Philadelphia by participating in the anti-bicentennial march. As reported in the New York Times, quote, one of the major themes at this demonstration, sponsored by a group called the July 4th Coalition, was a bicentennial without colonies, end quote. Hence the large Puerto Rican contingent among the 30,000 of us. To give you an insight into my feelings at the time, consider the following. The 20-year war in Vietnam, against which I had been protesting since the October 1969 Vietnam moratorium, had finally come to an end. But the President of the United States, Gerald Ford, had never been elected to either the vice presidency or the presidency. Ford had been appointed vice president when the former vice president, Spiro Agnew, had resigned his office due to a plethora of corruption charges brought against him. Ford then became president when Richard Nixon resigned rather than face an impeachment that appeared would result in expulsion from office. While great strides had been made with the passage of the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts of the early 19 and mid-1960s, the white backlash had put Richard Nixon into the White House in 1968. In the process of fighting for the great steps forward that had taken place in the 1960s, Medgar Evers was assassinated. John F. Kennedy was assassinated. Malcolm X was assassinated. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. Robert F. Kennedy was assassinated. And Fred Hampton was assassinated. And these were only the well-known figures who had been killed. It was pretty easy to get angry with the United States of America. While it may have felt anti-American to some, what I have come to realize is that we were angry not because we were against the ideals of America, but because so many of those ideals were being violated. I want to explore three major points in today's reflection. First, while the founders were far from perfect, their ideals are vitally important. Secondly, these ideals are uniquely American, but perhaps not in the way that you might normally think of that. And third, if we want to realize the arc of the moral universe bending toward justice, we must act. And these American ideals can provide the motivation for our actions. As Bill has just read, these ideals include that all people are created equal, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among people, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Let us just look at one aspect of these ideals through the lens of citizenship and the right to vote. We know that while these ideals were stated in the Declaration of Independence, they were far from being implemented at the time of the founding of the United States. Taking a quick trip through the past 200 years, thanks to Wikipedia, 1789, the Constitution is ratified. Generally, states limited this right to property-owning or tax-paying white males, about 6% of the population. 1868, citizenship is guaranteed to all male persons born or naturalized in the United States by the 14th Amendment. 1870, the 15th Amendment prevents states from denying the right to vote on grounds of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. 1920, women are guaranteed the right to vote by the 19th Amendment. Through various acts of Congress, others who had been excluded were slowly granted suffrage. 1924, Native Americans. 1943, Chinese immigrants. 1952, all Americans with Asian ancestry. 1965, protection of voter registration and voting for racial minorities, later applied to language minorities, is established by the Voting Rights Act. And in 1971, adults aged 18 through 21 are granted the right to vote by the 26th Amendment. There were many ups and downs during these 200 years. For example, the reason that Chinese immigrants were re-given the right to vote in 1943 was because it had been taken away from them by the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. And while Chinese immigrants were given the right to vote in 1943, Japanese immigrants were being rounded up and held in detention camps. For all of these ups and downs, I will assert that Theodore Parker got it right when he said, "I do not pretend to understand the moral universe. The arc is a long one. My eye reaches but little ways. I cannot calculate the curve and complete the figure by experience of sight. I can divine it by conscience. And from what I see, I am sure it bends toward justice." What do I celebrate on the 4th of July? I believe that the arc of the moral universe bends toward justice when we engage in the bending of that arc based on our ideals. These ideals are a very American legacy, but probably not in the way we tend to think about it. We generally think that the basis of the ideals for the founding of the United States came from the European Enlightenment thinkers, particularly Jean-Jacques Rousseau. In fact, some have accused Jefferson, albeit tongue-in-cheek, of plagiarizing Rousseau for portions of the Declaration of Independence. While both of these facts might be true, where did Rousseau get his ideas? The basis for the next few paragraphs comes from a book, The Dawn of Everything, by David Graeber and David Wengrow. As Europeans started to colonize America, particularly French explorers in the Great Lakes region, there was much dialogue between French government leaders, Jesuit priests, and Native American leaders. Candiaronc was a philosopher-statesman of the Wendat, also known as the Huron Confederacy. He met and had extensive dialogues with a French aristocrat and government official known as Baron Lahontan. Candiaronc was, quote, engaged in a complex geopolitical game, trying to play the English, French, and 5 nations of the Haudenosaunee, also known as the Iroquois Confederacy, off against each other with the long-term goal of creating a comprehensive indigenous alliance to hold off the settler advance, end quote. Candiaronc raised significant critiques of European society, which Lahontan recorded in a dialogue form and published. This and several other such critiques were published in the early 18th century. As with Candiaronc, these Native Americans had participated in republican forms of government in both the Huron and Iroquois confederacies. As French political philosophers grappled with these critiques, one of them, Rousseau, decided to write what became a critique of the French monarchy. We now know of this as the basis of the American Revolution, which in a strange way it was. It was founded based on a form of government that was already existing in America, the very republics that the European colonizers were attempting to subdue to claim the land for themselves. As UUs, we have embodied a number of these American ideals in our principles: the inherent worth and dignity of every person, justice, equity, and compassion in human relations, a free and responsible search for truth and meaning, the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process within our congregations and in society at large. Our forebears had great flaws when they founded this country, but they based the new nation on a set of ideals that continue to ring true for us today. We as UUs certainly have a long way to go before we can say that we are truly living out our principles. Imperfect though we may be, may we celebrate the 4th of July to treasure these American ideals. May we also challenge ourselves to continue to work to bend the arc of the moral universe toward justice.
At the age of 10, I read Day of Glory, a slender paperback by Philip Spencer, and I was hooked on the American Revolution. My interest increased after reading Esther Forbes' Newbery Award-winning classic, Johnny Tremaine, twice, and then seeing the movie. It was an interest that lasted a long time and likely influenced my earning a bachelor's degree in American history. I believed as a 10-year-old that the founding fathers were working toward what was right. Democracy, freedom of religion, unalienable rights, whatever that meant, liberty, it all sounded good to me as a 10-year-old, and it still does. The Declaration of Independence started out as just that, a declaration of independence from the king and from the British Empire. Over time, it has come to mean more. It has become one of the foundations of on which American democracy is built. All men are created equal. All men are granted unalienable rights. Governments derive their power from the consent of the governed. In an age of empires, colonies declaring independence and critiquing their king's performance was nearly unheard of. It was a step forward, and yet, from the time the Declaration was written, the practice has not lived up to the promise. Perhaps the words Thomas Jefferson wrote started this country down the path that led to a Bill of Rights, the 14th and 19th Amendments, the Civil Rights Act, and other changes, but that progress has been slow. All men may have been created equal, as Jefferson wrote, but they certainly were not treated that way at the birth of this country, nor since. Jefferson, a Unitarian, wrote the draft of the Declaration of Independence. However, as UUs, we might still question who he was writing it for and whom the Congress in Philadelphia represented. We are a denomination, after all, that believes in the use of the democratic process within our congregations and in society at large. The list of people who voted Jefferson and the others into office was quite short. Although there were exceptions at various times and places, the percentage of Americans denied participation in democracy was often over 90% in the 18th century and changed very slowly. Like Keith, I also looked at voting rights as a measure of equality and liberty. There were restrictions before and after the Declaration of Independence, just as there would be when the United States was founded in 1788, just as there would be throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, just as there are now. Although it may seem that these voting rights once granted are secure, they are not. Women had the right to vote at various times in various states prior to the 19th Amendment, but lost it. New Jersey was one state. Utah was another. Early in the 19th century, the Supreme Court, in the infamous Dred Scott case, ruled, among other things, that if your ancestors came to the U.S. as slaves, you could never be a U.S. citizen, despite the fact that 5 states at the time allowed freed slaves to vote. Newly freed African American men got the right to vote after the Civil War. However, terrorism and legislation meant they lost it by the mid-1890s, and they did not regain it again until the passing of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Now that act is under attack. In 2013, the U.S. Supreme Court weakened the Voting Rights Act by allowing counties with histories of racial discrimination to opt out of its requirements. The court has weakened it further in decisions in 2018 and 2021. This has led several states to limit access to voting and limit representation even when voting is allowed. This week, the Supreme Court has said it will rule on one of those disputes in its next session. Yikes. Some parts of the United States can vote, but are still not represented in Congress. For example, despite a larger population than either Vermont or Wyoming, the District of Columbia has no representatives in Congress and only got the vote in presidential elections in 1961. U.S. territories, be careful not to call them colonies, with nearly 4 million people, do not have voting representatives in Congress, nor do their votes for president count. Puerto Rico, the largest U.S. colony, territory, would be about the 30th largest state and have 4 or 5 representatives if its citizens' votes counted. Independence is not necessarily about voting rights, although the lack of representation and making it difficult for legislatures to meet were among the grievances against King George III that Jefferson enumerated in the Declaration. But it is an example of how people are not treated equally and how the democratic process is fragile. Acts of Congress, constitutional amendments, and court decisions expand rights, but they also have a history of taking them away. Declaring independence from the British Empire and its ruling monarch did not suddenly turn our country into a land where all people were equal or where everyone had basic human rights. We have made progress. Landmark legislation and constitutional amendments have brought us closer to all people being equal. But I see that progress as fragile, with many Americans willing to turn the clock back 100 years, 200 years. We have taken steps forward, we have taken steps backward. As a 10-year-old, I rooted for the revolutionary side to win. Their ideas of equality and unalienable rights were good in theory, if not in practice. Those ideals are still good and still not practiced. Yet I am still rooting for those ideals, the equality of all people and human rights for all, to be the winning side. On a more optimistic note, we will now sing hymn number 121, We'll Build a Land.
We'll build a land where we bind up the broken. We'll build a land where the captives go free, where the oil of gladness dissolves all mourning. Oh, we'll build a promised land that can be. Come build a land where siblings and cousins, anointed by God, may then create peace, where justice shall roll down like waters, and peace like an ever-flowing stream. We'll build a land where we bring the good tidings to all the afflicted and all those who mourn, and we'll give them garlands instead of ashes. Oh, we'll build a land where peace is born. Come, build a land where sisters and brothers, anointed by God, may then create peace, where justice shall roll down like waters, and peace like an ever-flowing stream. We'll be a land building up ancient cities, raising up devastations from old, restoring ruins of generations. Oh, we'll build a land of people so bold. Come build a land where sisters and brothers, anointed by God, may then create peace, where justice shall roll down like waters, and peace like an ever-flowing stream. Come build a land where the mantles of praises resound from spirits once faint and once weak, where like oaks of righteousness stand her people. Oh, come build a land, my people we seek. Come build a land where sisters and brothers, anointed by God, may then create peace, where justice shall roll down like waters, and peace like an ever-flowing stream.
Go now in this world as a beacon of hope and joy. Go in love, go in peace. Now that our worship has ended, our service begins. May it be so. Amen. Blessed be.